Let's talk about Suldrun's Garden by Jack Vance, book 1 in the Lyonesse trilogy, his late career 1980s epic fantasy trilogy, or semi-epic. This is the blurb. Take a doomed princess, a dispossessed prince and a wicked king, a vengeful magician and a melancholy witch. Now add fairies, ogres, changelings, scheming barons, wanderers who are not what they seem, robbers, orphans, and a race of hard-bitten warriors at war with all humanity. Stir in politics, intrigue, plots, assassinations, battles and sieges, then set it all to simmer in a mythical archipelago across the western sea before the time of Arthur. This is a sprawling adventure and political plot. It is a prototype, really, and this is sometimes brought up. You can see it's in a line with something like A Song of Ice and Fire. It is definitely sprawling. There are lots of viewpoints. You have the most recurring is Prince Aelus. You also have someone called Princess Suldrun, not from the same royal family. It's Princess Suldrun's father, King Casimir, Droon, a character called Droon, a character called Shimrod, and Ford Carfiliot, the dangerous Count of Tinsinfirel. It spans the whole of the main island of the Elder Isles. You know, if you like, the continent, as it were. By the way, that is the map. It's near France, Britain, Ireland, Spain, in the Bay of Biscay. You go all into nearly every nation on that map at some point. It is very sprawling, lots of cultures, lots of things you see. And what's great, Vance is great at this whole setting and the description of the setting. His landscapes are great. The ideas he has are really interesting. Scar, the proto-Vikings who have been chased out by the Scandinavians, by the Nordics, and now are on Skargain and a few other islands, who raid everywhere, who see everyone else as subhuman to them. It is better to be their slave, because then you are almost, you're a human, but just a very inferior one, to be a slave rather than to be anybody else. They're very well realised. There's lots of dark and twisty things, characters and plot items that are good. Many of the characters are quite satisfying. Shimrod the magician is my favourite. He's good at the characters being a trope. There's not really development on the whole. You see a bit of development with Shimrod, maybe why he's my favourite. And you see stakes change for characters. They end up caring about different things. That's not quite the same thing as character development, if by that we mean something changes in the character. But that's the kind of style Vance goes for. It is one of his more serious sets of books, I think, or at least I've only read this one, so this trilogy is, as I understand it, as a whole, amongst the more serious stuff he writes, and he often gets a tone of high adventure and wonder quite well. There are some moderate problems, and there's a big problem, which meant that I liked this, and I'm mulling whether to continue. And by I liked it, I mean I really enjoyed some parts and really didn't enjoy others, and I'm mulling whether to continue in the trilogy. And a smallish issue is a couple of the character arcs, are sort of frustrating or don't resolve well in this book for the purposes of this book. Princess Suldrun, after whom this is named, in her garden. She's a great character. I really liked her. Her garden, with no spoiler attached to that, is a really interesting, beautiful, wonderful place. Suldrun herself, it doesn't feel like what she does in this book or what happens to her in this book is satisfying. It doesn't really resolve in a satisfactory way for the character, not for everything else in the world or the plot, but for her, like what she does here and accomplishes here. And there are a few cases like that where you're like, oh, okay, this is fine. I should say, actually, one more very strong thing is how good his fairies are. If you want good, darkish fae, in the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or in the maybe Lord Dunsany style, go for this. But yeah, so some character stuff doesn't really come off, and that's a bit frustrating. There are some issues with pacing, as I say, and that does affect the character work, particularly with Suldrun. One thing, so my big problem is with tone and vision, and that can be split into two things. One smaller, one, and by smaller I mean smaller in terms of its impact on me, and one larger. The smaller one is that two of his influences are the late Roman world and Arthurian myth. And basically, a big problem is that he doesn't really like late classical civilization or the medieval Christian mythos. He's very openly contemptuous of both. And the problem here is not that he thinks that, but that he then wants to use aspects of that as a major form of trope in his books. Or at least sometimes they are major. There are moments where you can tell he's aiming for an Arthurian feel, and if you read some of the good versions of the Arthuriad, you'll find this kind of adventurous tone that comes up here with kind of weird encounters with monsters and fae and stuff and strange powers. It's very tonally similar to that, more than really nearly anything else, in terms of how it integrates the tale of knights and kings and politics into the world of fairy. And the world of magic, I should say, in Arthurian terms, the Long Ivy. But Vance just doesn't actually like that world or buy that world, and therefore he doesn't go here. He doesn't have a love for it and an understanding of it that means it comes in. Whereas the other stuff like the Fae themselves, or pagan mythology, stuff through the Vikings and the Skargane works really well. And it's not inevitable that when you're drawing on pre-Christian sources, you therefore can't integrate other things from the Christian mythoi, right? Paul Anderson in Three Hearts and Three Lions is very good at having this Celtic influenced, fundamentally pre-Christian world, but also introducing parts of the Matters of France and the Tale of Roland and Charlemagne into that, and doing that really well, integrating them really successfully. And I think that's because Anderson's, and you see the same in Three Hearts and Three Lions, Anderson understood his sources and respected them, whereas I think Vance struggles with some of them. The bigger, and that just means some bits are unsatisfying or frustrating. The bigger issue is a repeated, unpleasant, frankly disturbing and creepy way of talking about and speaking about and depicting, young women particularly, so it's sometimes children. The sexualization of women in this book is at points deeply discomforting. And I don't mean anything to do with Jack Vance himself, the historical figure. I mean, in the book, there is a, more than in other things by Vance I've read, a leering and unpleasant approach where you have 9-year-olds considered beautiful. There is a particularly disturbing rape scene, which, and I said that in that context, frankly very strange and unnecessary, not accomplishing very much for the story. And there are a bunch of things like this. It's not dominant. It's not like, oh, well, out of 450 pages, 200 of them are like that. It's, in a sense, it's only a dozen pages or something, but it's a dozen pages so dodgy and unpleasant that that's what makes me question the most going on. Because I'm like, well, do I really want to read something that is integrating, if you want to put it this way, integrating that aspect of pagan mythology into things, and in that way, the fairies stealing children for brides kind of stuff. That is not a direct reference. That is an example. So I don't know. That's a tough one. It's big enough that it's a big enough issue for me that the undeniable strengths do not make it trivial to just read more. Because there's limited time in the world, we all die eventually, right? And so what do I want to spend in the next X years reading? And it may not include books that just make me feel a bit dirty. Anyway, that is a mixed review. I don't know if I can recommend it to you on any basis. I liked some bits, I hated others. Your mileage may vary. Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me what other good fairy and Arthurian stories in the comments. Till next time.